Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, Jon Schwabish. On this week's episode of the show, I talked to Tomas Pueyo, who runs the Uncharted Territories newsletter on Substack. Tomas's content covers, well, basically everything from climate change to the war in Ukraine to sex and romance and relationships, COVID. I mean, you name it, he is going deep into these various topics. And so what you'll hear in our conversation is how he goes about doing that. And more importantly, if you're listening to this because of data visualization, his thoughts on maps. He has a terrific Twitter thread that I will link to in the show notes on how maps distort our perceptions of the world. And so we talk at length about how maps do that and how AI and new technologies might help us make maps better. So before I let you go into this week's episode, I would just ask you if you could take a moment, rate or review this podcast on your favorite podcast provider, be it Apple, be it Spotify, be it Google Podcasts, whatever you listen to. Please consider leaving a rating or review. And while you're heading over to the Uncharted Territories newsletter from Tomas, please consider signing up for my PolicyViz newsletter. It comes out every other week to correspond with the podcast. You get a draft blog post or other things that I'm working on, a list of things I'm reading and watching, a list of data visualizations that I think are particularly interesting, and in this week's newsletter, a little poll to ask you what you think I should be doing on my YouTube channel. So enough of that. Let's get into the podcast episode. Here is my conversation with Tomas Pueyo of Uncharted Territories. Hi, Tomas. Good to meet you. Welcome to the show.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Very excited to chat with you. We've got a lot to talk about because your Substack newsletter, Uncharted Territories, you cover a lot of ground. So I think we have a lot to chat about. But I thought we would just start with maybe you talk a little bit about your background and how you kind of got to the point now where your Substack newsletter is like your thing, your gig.
Yeah. So I used to live in the Bay Area and I worked in tech. I did that for around 15 years doing product and growth. And I started writing on the side. I never published anything. But after a few years, I decided, okay, I'll just start writing. I posted on Medium. And then at the beginning of COVID, I got a couple of articles that exploded virally. So I started gathering an audience there, and eventually moved to Substack. And for some reason that I have a hard time understanding, some people are willing to pay money to hear my opinions. And there's enough of them now that I can live off of it.
Right.
And so at the beginning of this year, I dropped my product and tech career, and I'm focusing full time on this.
Yeah, and you are covering, I mean, I was just scrolling through like the archives, which is great on Substack. You just kind of like look through everything, but like you cover attraction, between people. You talk about Ukraine, climate change, maps, which we'll talk about in a second. Like, so what inspires you, or how do you find, I mean, there's plenty of content, but like, how do you find, like, what drives you to write about the topics that you write about?
Oh my God, there's too much of it. I think, in fact, as a creator, it's a penalty, right? Because people, they want to follow, for example, an expert on COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or an expert on economy or something like this.
Right.
And they have a really hard time understanding a person who touches a lot of topics, especially because, like, by definition, if you have breadth, you cannot have depth,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think this has penalized me in terms of audience, but I find it so boring to just focus on one thing that I just don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And I think in my case, I just want to understand how the world works. And once we understand that, we can decide, okay, how should we nudge it in the future in the right direction?
Right.
And I think for me, the biggest thing is everybody's very siloed. And when people are very siloed, it's very hard to have to make decisions that require being cross-disciplinary. I'll just give you an example, right? So some people talk about fertility, right? And there's an issue about fertility today. There's not enough kids. People say there's too many people, right? Well, why some people say that actually there's too many people in the world because of climate change
Hmm.
and the environment, right? And so you need to understand environmentalism if you want to understand this. Others say actually no, the cause of the fertility crisis is economic, right? There's not enough economic growth. Others say no, it's urbanization. Others say no, it's cultural. And so you actually need to understand the history of fertilization of fertility. You need to understand economics. You need to understand urbanism. You need to understand all of these things to
Hmm.
understand some of these topics. And this is one of the reasons why I talk about all these topics, right? You mentioned climate change. The climate change, the origin of that was fertility,
Hmm.
and then you also mentioned maps and geography, and one of the keys there is we don't understand today how much our everyday lives are influenced by geography.
Mm.
And if we understand that, then we can understand so much more of how the world is today and then how we can influence it for the future.
Right. And where does, because I do want to talk about maps because you have this great Twitter thread,
Yeah.
and that was the original instinct for me reaching out. But
Uh,
where does the data come into play in your, both in the workflow, like, how do you
yeah.
start collecting data, and then also in the final product? I mean, you are more or less making an argument, sort of telling stories, but everything's sort of supported with data. So how are you thinking about, I guess the first question is, where are you looking for data? How are you working with it, processing it? And then how do you think about weaving that into an article where people are not going to just, nod off and say, this guy's give me
Yeah.
a bunch of numbers? I mean, that's not easy to do.
It is. You're right. I think this goes at the heart of how this is fascinating. There's two pieces that you need to do really well independently, right? You need to do the content well, and
Mm-hmm.
then you need to do the communication well. And most of the people do one or the other,
Yeah.
right? Like you can see this, for example, in every scientific paper. Like there's a lot of content in there, but nobody reads them,
Yeah.
and vice versa. Most of the communication today feels shallow, right? And so the reason why this is the case is because the skill set for one or the other is completely different.
Mm.
And you really need to master them both if you want, I think, to be really impactful. And so on the content side, because there's so much communication that is very shallow and superficial, you need to go to the people who really have the content, and that means most of the time reading scientific papers.
Mm.
And so, like for example, lately I'm talking a lot about sex, differences between sexes, and how that shapes human behavior. And I've probably read at this point about 200 papers,
Yeah.
like maybe like 50 of them full, the rest skimmed
Mm-hmm.
or abstract.
Right.
But I go straight to the papers because that's really where the source information is.
Yeah.
And for each topic that I take, I go deep into that, and so that requires a lot of time, of course. But that's one of the good sides of doing something that you're passionate about,
Yeah.
is like you don't see the time. I can spend
Right.
like 60 hours a week reading papers,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to be late, and I'm not going to be tired. So that's on the content side. I read a lot of these primary sources, and then the key becomes how do you package them
Yeah.
in an interesting way. And there, I studied storytelling, a lot of storytelling. I went when I went to Stanford. I took script writing classes.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a book about storytelling. I gave a TEDx about storytelling. All of that was to force myself to understand storytelling better, and then I use those structures in all of the articles that I
I
write.
see. I see. So I wonder if you could give folks maybe some advice on how to read scientific papers, because that is
Yeah,
also a skill, and a lot of people
yeah,
are not, they're not academics, they don't have higher degrees, and like I think the idea of
yeah,
reading an academic paper is daunting for a lot of people, but like you said,
yeah, yeah,
that's where the source material is from. So I mean, let's just take one that, like, your background may not be in sex and fertility, right? Like,
yeah,
right. So like, how, I guess, where do you start? How do you start? How do you start reading those papers so that you
yeah.
feel like you can become an expert, at least for the goal of writing, 3, 4, 6, 10, newsletter articles?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a few ways to do it. Like one is first you need to find them, right? And there's a couple of ways to do this. Like there's a few search engines such as Consensus, I think that's called. Other just going straight to Google. You put your question, you write your question, and then you add paper and
Mm.
then file type. PDF,
Okay.
right? And so like that usually is going to get either the search engines or this that's going to give you a lot of these papers. Then the papers are always going to have an abstract, which is a summary. It's usually 10 lines. It takes you like 3 minutes to read. Um, it is they are usually written with a lot of jargon, but because it's just 10 lines, even with jargon, you can make an effort and try to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases, you just need to read the abstract to give a sense to understand what the article is saying. If you need to go into the detail, I think a couple of keys there is the structure of the article itself. Usually there's an introduction, then there's maybe a methodology, then there's results, and then there's the discussion. The introduction is puts the study in context for with all the other studies, and so it's actually very good to start in a field by reading one or two papers
Mm-hmm.
on the field, because it's going to point you to all the other relevant people and really relevant papers. And so you very, very quickly can understand, okay, who are the most relevant people here and who are the most relevant papers.
Yeah.
And so like there you can just follow the thread and get to the top papers. Many of these papers are going to be meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis are the best to start to really have a good sense of what's happening. So the introduction here there is valuable, especially for the first papers in a field that you're reading. Then methodology, I usually jump because it's only relevant insofar as the results
Mm-hmm.
are weird, right? It's like, or you have questions about it, like, oh, they found this thing that's weird. Like, why? How many people did they research? Is it a bias sample? Things like this. And so
Right.
you need to go to the methodology, and usually you don't need to go to the methodology. I usually browse also to see if there's a graph,
Mm-hmm.
because graphs usually are going to show you many of the insights easily summarized. And then I really want to understand the details of what happened, I read the results.
Right.
Results are going to give in details. Okay, we did like this was the result of this thing, and this was the result of this thing. And then finally, the discussion usually is a bit like the abstract, but in detail. So bottom line, how to look at a paper, usually just the abstract. If you want to go more details, if you're new in the field, look at the intro to understand all the other papers
Mm-hmm.
in the field. If not, just go to the discussion. And then if you want to go deeper, you can go to the results. And if you want to go deeper, you can go to the methodology.
Right. Good. Is there a tool that you use to manage your like references and citations and all those PDFs?
It's not. I'm so bad. I'm so bad.
Me
Sometimes
too.
in my newsletter, I have to write.
Yeah.
I read this somewhere. I'm sorry. I cannot find it anymore. I heard people use Zotero.
Yeah.
I used
Yeah.
to. I never used it.
Yeah, I
So
haven't used
maybe
it either,
I
but
don't know.
a colleague of mine swears by it. Like
Mm.
I saw him yesterday, and he was giving me a hard time because I'm not using Zotero, so I have to.
Maybe I should.
I think it's a big startup cost when you have like a whole library that you just want to move in. It's not like you could go to like I don't think you can go to Google Scholar, like
Mm.
copy the citations, drop it into Zotero. I think it's a little bit more
Yeah.
manual than that. So
Yeah, and in my case, I don't even I have no system. My system is really uh, linking the articles, like the papers in my articles,
yeah,
and that becomes my index because I remember my articles, and so I can go back. Oh,
right,
what was this paper? So that's now my like, which is shitty. It's terrible.
yeah,
But I think the point there is you can go pretty far without any system,
hmm,
and so I'm the kind of person to say, if you're not a pro and you're thinking about your system for citations, then you're doing something wrong. You're procrastinating into actually just starting and working on this.
right, right. So let's go to maps because this was the reason I reached out in the first place
Yeah,
because you have this amazing Twitter thread about geography and about maps, which tags back to what you were talking about earlier on how you sort of think about this
yeah,
broad landscape of content. And so one of the things I was looking back, and I think you have a thread that sort of pulls all of your maps together. It is this tremendously
yeah,
long, great thread. But like you talk
yeah,
about how maps distort the world, and I was
yeah,
hoping you could talk more about that and how it distorts countries, governments, people, how
yeah.
policy
I
works.
think that, yeah, for sure. So there's this the biggest way in which they're distorted is the fact that you need to put a sphere on a plane, right? So the equator is the biggest part of the world. The poles are just a point, and if you need to put them into a rectangle, you need to expand the poles a lot, and you keep the equator straight, right? And so the same. And so the result of doing this is the farther up you go, north or south you go away from the equator, the bigger the space is going to look like. And it happens that the closer you are to the equator, the poorer the countries usually are, and we can talk about it in a second because it's fascinating why. And the farther away you go, the wealthier the countries. And so it ends up being that the richer the country, the bigger it looks like on a map as opposed to reality. So, for example, if you look on a normal map, which is a Mercator projection, Greenland and Africa, they look kind of the same size,
Right.
when in fact one is massively bigger than the other.
Right.
And for me, I think two or three of the examples that are the most shocking here is the width of Africa is about the same as the width of Russia. And it looks like it's so much smaller,
Right.
but it's probably the same width. And then another one that really shocked me is Indonesia. The country of Indonesia is about the same extension as Europe. In fact, one of all of Europe. In fact, one of the things that is an interesting shortcut to use is there's a lot of big areas in the world that are quite similar in size. So the US is similar to Canada, Australia, India, China, Europe. You have all these big areas that are actually quite similar in size, and it definitely does not look like it in American map.
Yeah, I think the one that I always come back to is that Greenland, Saudi Arabia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are all about the same size. And
that's right.
I mean, Greenland is such the outlier there, right? In the way it's portrayed.
Exactly, because it's so sort of, and the crazy piece is that DRC is not even the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's not even the biggest country in Africa.
Right.
It's Algeria, and so it's not even. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So maybe talk a little bit about the so people understand the correlation between the distance from the equator and income, because you had mentioned that the poorer countries tend to be around the equator.
And this is crazy. So about 2-3 centuries ago, people started noticing this, right? Like the European colonialists coming from the north, they're going close to the equator in Africa, in America, in Asia, and seeing that they're poorer, and they starting making this hypothesis. And the hypothesis, of course, is going to be, they're lazier, right? And they work less. And so these racism, I think, has pervaded through the centuries, and usually I find these kinds of explanations of the world that are based on culture or morality be very poor to actually explain the world. Usually things are more connected to systems. And so, people are, one of the reasons what they're saying is like, yes, when you're closer to the equator, it's warmer. And so because it's so warm, you cannot really work as much. Meanwhile, as Protestants in Northern Europe, we work so much, and we're so hard workers, right? It's like, really? It is true that when temperatures increase, productivity decreases, but it doesn't mean that the being just warmer means you work less. So I'm looking into this a lot. There's actually less written about this than you would imagine. And my current hypothesis is the following. When you're closer to the equator, because it's so hot, the places that get inhabited are different than closer to the poles. In Europe, the Alps, for example, the Pyrenees, or in the US, the Appalachians, those are not populated, right? Mm-hmm. It's too cold. And then you have the plains that are populated. It is the reverse as you get closer to the equator, right? For example, you look at the map of Colombia, all the people are on the mountains. They're not in the jungles. They're not in the. In fact, the Inca Empire was on the mountains.
Right.
The Aztecs were on the mountains, and Mexico is the highest. It's very, very high in elevation. La Paz in Bolivia is one of the highest elevation capitals in the world. And so you have this pattern of the mountains are the ones that are populated when you're closer to the equator. And it so happens that mountains are very bad for economic development,
Right.
because it makes trade so much harder, and so there's much less. And so you need to consume everything locally, which means that you have a big local population, but you don't have a lot of trade, so you don't make a lot of money, so you're really poor.
Right. Not to mention the colonialism that you mentioned earlier. That
that's right.
Yeah.
But like that, then we get into a complete different.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And if you want one day, we can debate it.
I don't know if people are going to listen to an 8-hour podcast, so we'll move on. So when you have this understanding or background of thinking about how maps distort our perception of the world, and so when you write about the various pieces of content that you write about, do you try to educate your readers on some of these aspects of distortion? So when you write about economics, or you write about, fertility rates, I mean, any climate change, any of these things that you're talking about, and the way that people think about the world is not necessarily true. Like you just said, these distortions that we see in the size of countries and how they're arranged and how they're aligned are not necessarily true. So do you try to, kind of break that thought process that probably many of your readers have?
Yeah, I think I try to do that with every topic that I touch. Right, I think I'm trying to take examples. Right, I think one of them is that illustrates a bit to your point is why the island of Java in Indonesia has more population than all of Russia, which is the biggest country in the world, right? And you can show the sizes. It's ridiculous how different the sizes are, right? And then you can go into the detail, like you use that as a hook, right? And then you can go into the detail, and it turns out that one of the main reasons why Java is so populated is because of volcanism. Because it's a volcanic island. It's east-west. There's volcanic eruptions, and then all the ash falls on the land, and the ash is amazing for the fertility of the ground.
Right.
And so the growth of rice there is orders of magnitude better than in neighboring Sumatra, for example.
Right.
So that's an example. But I think if you generalize it, this is what I try to do with each one of the topics. Right, it's like let's try to go deep and understand which ones of our preconceived opinions were right and which ones were wrong. And I'll give you another example. I was looking into climate change, right? I come at every topic without a bias. Like I just want to understand it, like what's going on. And so for climate change, my prior there was the Earth is going to be like the survival of Earth is going to be challenged in this event that has never ever happened before, right? And so when I looked into the details, it turns out that the temperature of the Earth was higher 3 million years ago and earlier. There was more CO2 at that point. The previous events of mass animal destruction were probably worse than they're going to be here. And so you start seeing these claims that, okay, I thought these were true, they're not. And then you can zero in into the ones that are, right? And so what is true, like the speed of the change is the fastest that it's ever been. That's one. And then the economic displacement is going to be very, very, very bad.
Right.
Humans are not going to disappear. Nature is not going to disappear. Most animals are not going to disappear. But it's going to be really bad for a bunch of animals and economically for a lot of people, which might cause emigrations and wars and things like this, right? And so, but narrowing down what specifically the issue is then allows us to better understand what the problem is and then to better solve it.
Right. And so it sounds like a lot of your work is in a lot of ways sort of fighting the misinformation and disinformation that's out there, because you're trying to go deep and not necessarily refuting some claim that someone's made, but to educate people on some topic really based in the literature. So when you are, do you feel that responsibility when you're writing, that you're trying to resolve, you're trying to fight against that a little bit?
Yes, it is very much. It's very much the aim of what I'm trying to do, right? Really deeply understand the world so you can nudge it in the right direction.
Yeah.
And it's what we were saying, right? The uh, those who are good at communicating are usually bad at understanding the content, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so bridging that gap, I think is important. And there are a few people doing it, but not enough. And I think at the end of the day, most of the decisions that we take as a society, either culturally or politically, are based on the analysis of these problems. And if you don't understand these problems, you will make poor decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best example of this is what I did in COVID, right? And the high my first articles became very viral. The first one was alerting the world, hey, this is coming, and you don't understand what's going on. You need to close your country as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
That got around 50 million views. And then the next one after that, the hammer and the dance, was a proposal on how actually to manage the pandemic. And the idea of it is, look, you have no idea what's going on, and so the only thing you can do is you need to stop everything right now to understand better,
Mm-hmm.
and to build stopgap solutions. And once you understand that, then you need to do a very rational, like ROI based analysis on what measures you should have at any given point.
Yeah.
And so this simple idea, then like, lots of countries actually follow that strategy at the beginning, and that makes sense. But then they started misunderstanding it, and we had lockdowns for more than 2 years.
Yeah.
Which I think make no sense, because the economic impact that this has is way above the benefit that it gives.
Mm.
And so you end up in a position where, because you misunderstand the problem, you don't know what are the right solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And then society suffers.
Mm.
And so what I did for COVID is very much what I tried to do for each one of these other
Right.
these myths.
I wanna blend your early career work with your current career work. So we've seen, because you've written a bit about blockchain, you've written a bit about AI, and I'm curious about the data viz piece of, particularly of maps, since that's a focal point, and AI.
Yeah.
Like, how do you see those two interacting in the next few years?
Yeah.
Like, is AI going to make the challenge of making maps and doing geographic analysis easier, or is it going to be, are our misperceptions of geography going to feed into the AI and exacerbate our perceptual problems?
I think the current map representations are so much worse than they can be.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example. When you see a normal map, like, first, usually these are political maps, right? So they show states, nation states, but nation states are very recent. Like, I think we have close to 200 countries now in the world, mm-hmm. but 70 years ago, we had something like 53, right? And then if you go 200 years ago, there were only 12 nation states,
mm-hmm.
right? So it's super recent, super new, and yet this is what we show. So that tells you another example of how map distorts a perception, right? For me, one of the even better examples is mountains. Like, relief topography maps show you a little bit where there's plains and where there's mountains, but they don't tell you the key insight about plains and mountains, which is mountains are very fucking hard to climb. Yeah. Right? And so, for example, like, what is easier, to walk 100 kilometers or to climb 1 kilometer? Right? Like, hands down, walking 100 kilometers is easier, right? Yeah. But if you show 100, like, to scale, right, it's going to look like, oh, this mountain is this tiny thing, it doesn't matter. And so you need to show exaggerated, extremely exaggerated altitude maps for a map to convey the key insight, which is not the altitude,
Yeah.
it is the difficulty for humans.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of exaggerated topography maps are relatively recent, right? And now, like, there's been an explosion of the last few years. Uh, and so, and this is an example where if you have an AI tool that can take a data point and display it more easily, then you can have substantial more creativity on how you can show them. So displaying existing data is one of the big areas for improvement, and the other one is joining data. Like 90% of the work of geographers is just like finding the right data and putting cleanly, but this is like trivial for an AI. And so sites and AI that can put all this information in one place, easily accessible, and without knowing ArcGIS or any coding thing, any person can map anything. Like, there's going to be an explosion on maps and the insights that come with it. There's going to be a lot of shit.
Yeah.
But the 2% that are amazing are going to be so much better than anything that we've seen before, that I think map mapping is going to see a massive renaissance.
Yeah, that is an optimist. I like the optimistic take on it.
I'm always optimistic.
Do you have a favorite map of any topic? Is there like a map that you like?
I think those exaggerated topography maps are my favorite. I think like just showing these the mountains exaggerated really gives you a core insight. And I think so. That's one. There's another one. We in technology, there's always this thing where when a new technology arrives, people just transpose the previous technology to the new one, right? So, for example, if you take cinema, right, for 30 years after cinema, movies were mostly theater but recorded, right? And then movies like Citizen Kane come around and completely reinvent storytelling based on the media. Something similar, I think, is happening with maps. Because maps were on paper, they were mostly fixed, right? And I don't think a fixed map, a static map, conveys most information. And I'll give you an example. For me, the one of my favorite maps is an animated map that contrasts plains and mountains with population density. And so if instead of having one or the other, right? So imagine the height, like the height on one side, plains, mountains, and the other one is where people live. And so if you put them side by side, you're not going to really be able to see the patterns easily because your eyes needs to go from one to the other, and it's hard to compare. But if you put them one by one on top of the other, and you show and you take it off, you can very easily see. Oh, interesting! In temperate areas, there's a perfect overlap between plains and people.
Right.
And vice versa. In more equatorial areas, the overlap is on the mountainside.
So what I like about that, the way you describe that, is moving away, I guess, from your traditional like geographic map or Mercator projection or Robinson projection, but just rethinking how the geography is presented, just layering mountains and plains on top of each other and not worrying about what projection we use. Just like, I don't know, it's just a different way of thinking about presenting geographic data rather than just like our traditional map.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing two points that are valuable. One of them is accuracy, and I think accuracy is very important. And I think we're going to get even more accuracy in the future. There's a reason why Mercator has actually is being used now too. It's the one that makes the least how to say distortion at the zoom in zoom out level, right? So Google Maps use Mercator or used to because you zoom in, you zoom out, it looks the same locally, globally, and there's no problem. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but if you zoom out enough from Google Maps, then it starts becoming a globe, Like there's a moment in like if you zoom in, it's plain, but it becomes a globe. And so I think these type of distortions we're solving now,
Yeah.
and it's going to be even easier to solve through AI and in the future. Uh, and then so that's kind of the first layer. But I think the second layer that makes me even more excited is just the insights. By
Yeah.
coupling the information in different ways, we're going to be able to understand geography in a way that we didn't before.
Right. So, so before we wrap up, you've got so on your Substack, Uncharted Territories. What do you have in the works? Like, what can people expect in the next few weeks, months,
Yeah,
years as you do this? Yeah.
yeah. I have at any given point, I have around 100 to 150 drafts that I'm working on
Oh
in
yeah.
parallel.
Yeah.
So it's pretty brutal. Right now, I'm still working on uh, this series around the game theory of sex, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of things that come from it, like for example, understanding slut shaming, and body counts. So like, why are we seeing problems there, and what can we do about that? There's topic about there's an area around real estate, for example. I have this hypothesis that real estate as an investment class is going to be substantially worse in the coming decades than it was in the previous ones.
Mm.
There's a question around future of education. I think education is not at all what we think it is, and the future is going to be massively changed through AI. Um, there's questions around climate change. I think climate change could already be solved right now if the people who care about really did what they have to do about it. And
Mm-hmm.
so understanding what are the incentives there,
Mm-hmm.
how we can solve it, how we can change the incentives. Um, how many people should we have on Earth? Like, do we have too many? Can we have more? How is that linked to progress and economic development?
Mm-hmm.
So these are some of these like 50
Just
to 100
just a
topics
few
I've been
small
just a few.
topics
Yeah,
of
small questions.
small questions. Well, Tomas, thanks so much for coming on the show. I will
It's a
put
pleasure,
links
man.
to your TED Talk and to the Substack that everybody should check out. So thanks a lot for coming on the
Thank
show. I
you,
really appreciate it.
John. It was I had a lot of fun. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your work.
Thanks to everyone for tuning into this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you'll check out the list of links that I've put in the show notes, including some previous episodes of this podcast that I think are related to the conversation Tomas and I just had around inequality, around maps, and a variety of other topics. So until next time, this has been the Policy of His podcast. Thanks so much for listening.